Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm very much happy that ASPI gave me an opportunity to come back to Canberra to talk about the issue of China. Needless to say, the re-emergence of China as a great economic power has become very much a consuming issue for the global political community, for corporations, for NGOs, for a whole range of interests all over the world. And I use the term re-emergence to remind you that China was, over 250 years ago, the world's largest economy. Angus Madison estimates that before the British Industrial Revolution, China accounted for about a third of global output. India at the same time was about 25%. So China's new role as a great economic power is not unprecedented. There was simply a 200-year interruption before China again became the world's largest economy. Now, if we look at China's recent history, there's no doubt the economic achievements since Deng's reforms began back in 1979 have been truly awesome. China's nominal GDP has grown from $532 billion in 1982 to $9.3 trillion last year, and this year will easily exceed $10 trillion. To put that in perspective, the US GDP is about $16 trillion. In 2010, China displaced Japan to become the world's second largest economy. It now accounts for about 11.5% of global GDP compared to only 2.6% back in 1982. On a PPP basis, or what economists call purchasing power parity adjustment, its share of global GDP is actually about 14%. In 1981, nearly 85% of China's population lived on less than $1.25 a day. In those days, it had the fifth highest poverty incidence in the world. Today, by contrast, the ratio has fallen to less than 15%, well below the average for other developing countries. China achieved this great success through a policy of market opening and globalization. Its share of world exports has grown from 1.2% 30 years ago to 11.5% last year. Indeed, in 2011, China displaced Germany to become the world's largest exporter of tradable goods. If you look at the data for last year, looking at both exports and imports, at that point, China also displaced the United States to become the world's largest trading nation when you add up both exports and imports. China's stock of FDI, foreign direct investment, is just under $1 trillion. It's the highest number except for the US, France, and the UK. And there's no doubt in my mind within 4 or 5 years, China can overtake France and the UK. China now has 70 companies on the Fortune Global 500 list compared to only 11 10 years ago. And 66 of these companies are in fact SOEs, or what we call state-owned enterprises. China is also becoming a much more active global investor. In 2012, its outward FDI was $84.2 billion, a sum exceeded only by the US and Japan. And if we look around the world, we can see a very large stock now of foreign direct investment, which is becoming in some countries economically significant. The numbers are as follows. China has $91 billion of FDI in North America, $80 billion in Europe, $66 billion elsewhere in Asia, $57 billion in Australia and New Zealand, $58 billion in Africa, $55 billion in Latin America, and $22 billion in the Middle East. And much of this investment in the last 5 years has been very much focused on the natural resource sector. Back in 2008 and 2009, we passed a great landmark in world economic history. At that point, China became a larger consumer of base metals like copper, iron, lead, zinc, iron ore, and nickel than the United States and Europe combined. Indeed, right now, China consumes on average about 40 to 45% of all global output of copper, nickel, lead, zinc, and other base metals. This, I think, is a truly awesome change. And it means the dominant factor now in setting global commodity prices in Australia's own terms of trade is the Chinese economy. Up until the last 10 years, the dominant player was, of course, the United States. But now the American impact on commodity prices is quite marginal compared to China. China also now has $3.9 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, 3 times as large as the second major holder of foreign exchange reserves, Japan, which only has $1.3 trillion. Again, this I think is truly an awesome change because a stock of foreign exchange reserves that large can have an impact now on the global financial markets. In fact, there's been a great recurring fear in the US for the last 5 years that China might at some point sabotage the US by selling its $1.5 trillion of treasury bonds. The reality is China doesn't want the treasury bond market to suffer. They got a huge investment in it. But conspiracy theorists and extremists in the United States constantly worry about the danger that at some point China might sell the US bond market and produce a very large increase in interest rates. Now, China's had some major advantages in pursuing the high growth rate of the last 30 years. They've had a large supply of low-cost labor. They've had a very high savings rate, and therefore a very low cost of capital. They've had a remarkable tolerance for pollution and environmental destruction. And they've very much embraced the global trading system and a policy broadly defined as globalization. But these advantages are now fading, and they will be a constraint on Chinese growth over the next 20 or 30 years. First, China's labor force is now shrinking. Last year, it fell by over 2 million people. This reflects the fact that in the late 1970s, they introduced a one-child policy, and that one-child policy led to a big drop in the birth rate and a much smaller population of people under the age of 20. China now has the problem its population will be aging, and this, of course, over time will create a tremendous burden for pension funds and for health insurance. A few numbers to put it in perspective. In 2012, only 14% of China's population was over the age of 60, compared to 20% in the US, 27% in Germany, and 32% in Germany. China right now has 120 million people over the age of 65, but the number will grow to 166 million by 2020, 230 million by 2030, and 331 million by 2050. In 2050, over 26% of the population will be over the age of 60. The Chinese fear right now is they may grow old before they grow rich, which will mean a tremendous burden on the economy and on the social security system. China recently relaxed the one-child policy. They will now allow couples where only one person is from a single-child family to have more than one baby. This will be a positive, but it won't fundamentally change these demographics. It may lead to 1.5 or 2 million more babies being created compared to 16 million in 2012. So it's a positive, but it won't be a big positive. In fact, the only countries now in East Asia where we have population growth going on is the Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar. Everywhere else you go in Asia, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, birth rates have fallen very sharply, and all these societies will, in the next 20 or 30 years, confront the issue of an aging population and a shrinking labor force. China's other major advantage, a low cost of capital, is also about to change. They've had a long policy of what I'd call financial repression. They've imposed on the household sector a very low rate of return on bank deposits, only 2 or 3%. As a result, over the last 10 years, Chinese savers have had a negative real rate of return on their savings. And the result is high-income people now are looking for alternatives. And in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been lots of innovations to accommodate this demand. We've had trust banks emerge, offering savings products with the interest rates of 6% plus. And the big financial institutions, the big banks, have created what they call wealth management products. These are aimed at high-income people, and they also offer a rate of return 6% plus. These deposits now account for over 10% of Chinese bank deposits. And this will be a challenge going forward, because if you're going to pay a higher rate of return on your savings, on your deposits, you'll have to ultimately raise the interest rates you charge on borrowers. So this low interest rate policy China's had for many, many years is breaking down. We also saw 9 months ago the introduction for the first time of internet banking services. And the internet banks are also offering much higher rates of return, 6% plus, than conventional bank deposits. Now, in this sector, we had a mini crisis 3 weeks ago. ICBC, the world's largest bank, announced that a $3 billion wealth management product it sold 3 years ago was about to have a default. The wealth management product assets were invested in loans to a coal mining company. The coal mining company went bust. ICBC said, we will not guarantee the value of these assets. This belongs to the trust company. They'll have to solve the problem. This was a major shock because the assumption of Chinese savers was if you bought a bank product, its safety was guaranteed. ICB said that is not true. When this news appeared 3 weeks ago, I was on the phone over the weekend calling people in China to find out what it would mean. And nobody knew exactly what it would mean, but they all recognized it as a serious danger. But a couple of days later, a deal was announced to rescue the coal mining company by an unknown investor to guarantee these assets would be safe. There might be some compromise on the interest payments, but the principle was safe. So China found a way to fudge the issue, to basically prevent this asset, this wealth management product, from having a default that might have jeopardized confidence in the whole system and led to capital flight from these products. But the very fact this happened does tell you, in this new financial system, this so-called shadow financial system, there is credit risk. And at some point, we don't know when, 2 years, 5 years, somebody will ultimately take a loss on these assets. And when that comes to pass, that could be a shock to confidence, and it could change how capital is allocated in the Chinese financial system. But it's still very much an evolving story. We don't yet have a final conclusion as to how it will play out. Another new constraint, of course, is the environment. China now has very severe pollution in many cities. The World Bank had a report a year ago that 16 of the world's 20 cities with severe pollution problems are in China. I have friends who now will not live in Beijing because the air pollution is so bad. They have young children, and they feel if they live in Beijing for 5 or 10 years, it could expose their children to the risk of cancer or other serious illnesses. Many people in China now also wear face masks. This wasn't true 10 years ago, but the problem is now very, very severe. And indeed, opinion surveys done in China show the Chinese people regard the environment to be a critical issue. So the government, therefore, has no choice but to try and address the problem. They're doing it in a variety of ways. Like Australia, under the Gillard government, they're introducing carbon trading, first in 6 provinces, but soon nationwide. They're also trying to reduce steel production in Hebei province, because that's very polluting, and that province is not very far from Beijing. They're also making a huge investment to move away from coal as their major source of power supply. Their core problem is they get 70% of their power from coal-based generation. They're now building dozens of nuclear power plants, and they will have by 2030 maybe as many as 200. They've got a huge investment in solar power and wind power, and this will, over time, gradually reduce the role of coal in power generation. But it will take 5 or 10 years, because right now these alternative power sources only account for about 8% of China's electricity generation. This is obviously a global issue as well, but I think because of the air pollution problem, it's a much more severe issue in China than many other countries. China is also changing its regulations. They are demanding now that in some regions, especially near Beijing, that we reduce the dependence on coal. And they did recently shut down some steel mills in Hebei province, again because they were very, very polluting. China's had environmental laws for many years, but the reality is they weren't enforced. The challenge now, I think, will be to finally enforce these laws and have an impact on pollution and damage to the environment. Another factor which has affected the economy in the last year is the campaign against corruption. We've had, in the last year, more arrests of high government officials than any time in China's modern history. It culminated in late December with the arrest of a man who a year and a half ago was a member of the Standing Committee, the 7 men who rule China and are always in China the most powerful people. The fact a man of this stature was arrested, I think, tells you this corruption campaign is very serious. And it's had an impact on the economy because it's led to a big decline in consumption of luxury goods. Businessmen use luxury goods as a way to bribe government officials to get deals done. So in the first half of last year, sales of Swiss watches fell by 25%. Remy Martin, a liquor company, reported a very big decline in their sales. In the October festivals, sales of mooncakes fell in half. Goldman Sachs had an estimate last year that the anti-corruption campaign reduced GDP growth by 0.3%. Now, they've had these campaigns before, but this one looks like it's a lot more enduring. And if this is true, it will be a constraint on consumption And it will also change how businessmen interact with government officials. Again, a further anecdote. I saw a Singapore property developer back in July last year who had been in Beijing for a big meeting in June on his big property development near Beijing. He told me this meeting with government officials, they were all very unique in one way. Not a single one had a wristwatch because they knew if their watches were seen publicly, it might lead to them being reported on blogs and could jeopardize their job security. So anyway, the anti-corruption campaign, I think, is a very serious one, and it is having effects on the economy and on business that are still evolving. In any case, the government does recognize these challenges I've just outlined. They had a major plenary in November, they have one every 5 years, to talk about the need for structural changes to address these problems. And the communique had a very important statement that market forces must now play a decisive role shaping the economy, whereas previous communiques said only market forces should play a basic role. This was interpreted by economists in Beijing, by political watchers in Beijing, as a sign that this new government, led by Xi Jinping and and his colleagues, will make market forces far more dominant in setting the agenda for China and shaping how economic policy evolves in the future. And there's a very long list of issues that flow from this commitment. It means enhancing the role of the private sector in accessing bank loans. It means reducing the role of the big state-owned enterprises. It means addressing issues like bad regulation, which can also discourage the creation of new small and medium-sized enterprises. It also means addressing the issue of immigration within China. Right now, they have 260 million people who've moved from the countryside to the cities who lack basic citizenship rights. In China, you must have a hoku to qualify for social services in the town where you live. But when you move from the countryside to the city, you don't automatically get a hoku. You have to wait for that, and you can wait a very long time. And therefore, many people living in the cities really are suffering inferior living standards. And many have to leave their children back in the countryside with their grandparents because they simply can't get them into schools in the big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Chongqing. So these are, very, very serious issues, and they'll be very much the substance of how Chinese policy evolves over the next 5 years. Now, at the current time, among economists and fund managers, there's a big debate about China. There are some very prominent people like George Soros who've become very pessimistic. They say China had, after the global financial crisis, a massive expansion of bank lending and infrastructure spending to try and keep the country out of recession. This policy was successful. China's growth rate rebounded very sharply in 2010 after dipping during 2008 and 9. But they believe this process has now gone so far, it creates its own risk of instability and potentially a very severe economic downturn. Others aren't as concerned. They recognize that China has had excesses, that China does have imbalances, but they think that China can basically work its way out of these imbalances and these excesses with a soft landing. And I would side with those that think China will make the adjustment with a soft landing, not a hard landing. There'll be a lower rate of economic growth in the next few years. The Chinese growth will go from double-digit numbers down to 7 or 8%. They won't fall with 2 or 3%, which the pessimists are currently suggesting is possible. So to examine this issue, we have to decompose what happened over the last 5 years in this surge of credit creation in China, which caused the ratio of non-financial debt to go from 130% of GDP to 220%. Basically, the big growth in borrowing was for two sectors: local governments carrying out the national government's infrastructure spending program, and state-owned enterprises, also having a large increase in investment to fight the global recession. The local governments are very vulnerable because they rely very heavily on real estate sales to fund themselves, and China's had policies in the last couple of years to try and curtail real estate speculation, which in turn has discouraged land sales. But because the local governments were carrying out national policy, not their own policy, I don't believe the central government will let them default. I think they'll simply roll over the loans. There'll be a kind of basic forbearance policy that will run for quite some time. I don't see the risk in China right now of major defaults. The SOEs, at the same time, also are very large companies. Some are monopolies in their sectors, and they've got stable cash flows. I don't think there's any danger of major Chinese SOE going bust. One new element of credit risk, though, is lending to small business. And there has been, in the last 3 years, a major change in Chinese bank lending. For the first time ever in China's modern history, banks are now making loans to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. This was quite large in 2010, 11, and 12. I saw high-level officials a few weeks ago at a Harvard conference from ICBC, and they told me now 17% of their balance sheet is SME loans. That's an extraordinary number compared to where they were 4 or 5 years ago. Loans to SMEs are by definition more high risk because they're smaller companies, they're not large state enterprises with monopolies, and therefore if the economy does turn down or they make a bad investment decision, there is the danger they could go bust. So we will have going forward, I think, in China, more credit risk. But this credit risk, I think, so far is benign because making loans to SMEs does increase the odds of China maintaining a high growth rate. Because in all countries, all over the world, the major source of economic growth is not big companies, it's SMEs. They generate the employment creation, they generate the new products. Whether it's America, whether it's Europe, whether it's Australia, SMEs are very, very critical to an economy achieving its true growth potential. Meanwhile, China's extraordinary growth in capital spending over the last several years has given the country a world-class manufacturing sector. And I think with the global economy improving in the year ahead, with higher growth rates in North America and in Europe, China is well positioned to have a good recovery in exports. And I'll give you a few numbers to put it in perspective. China now accounts for 38% of global output of office machinery, 34% of global output of telecom equipment, and 18% of global output of electronic components such as printed circuits, insulated wires, and batteries. China now consumes over half of world semiconductor output to produce 85% of the world's personal computers, 75% of the world's cell phones, and 55% of the world's color televisions. To put this in perspective, I would call your attention to the Las Vegas Electronics Show 4 weeks ago. This is the major consumer electronics event in North America every year. At the exhibition in January, China had 937 exhibitors. Taiwan had 75, Hong Kong had 55, the US had 903. This is the first time in history China had more exhibitors than the United States. This confirms how strong and how dominant their position now is in consumer electronics, especially for these new products involving the growth of social networking, telecom, and the rise of the cellular telephone. China also now has the world's largest automobile industry. In 2012, its auto output was 19.3 million vehicles, compared to 10.3 million in the US, 9.9 million in Japan, 5.6 million in Germany, and 4.6 million in Korea. China is not a global power in the auto sector. Its own domestic products are inferior compared to those in North America and Europe, but it's now exporting almost 1 million autos a year to developing countries. And the goal of some Chinese auto companies, like Geely, is to basically become global companies. And a couple of years ago, Geely bought Volvo in Sweden as a way to try and achieve a larger global market share. China's also spending more on R&D to become competitive. The Battelle Institute estimates that China spent $200 billion in 2012, compared to $436 billion in the US, $160 billion in Japan, $91 billion in Germany. China is spending about 1.6% of GDP on R&D compared to 2.8% in the US, 3.5% in Japan, 2% in Europe. But these numbers are increasing at double-digit rates. While the US right now is squeezing R&D spending, the federal government, because of its sequestration policy, is reducing R&D spending, which has been a critical player in the development of many American technologies. And the government also, in December, eliminated tax subsidies for R&D spending by the private sector. With America squeezing R&D spending and China having double-digit growth, I think by 2023, Chinese R&D spending could be larger than the United States. And if that were to come to pass, that would be, I think, a very important event, again, signaling who'll be most competitive over the next 20 or 30 years. China's challenge now, of course, is to shift from a heavy reliance on investment and exports to relying more on domestic consumption. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are financial policy changes going on right now which could help to promote this change. China, by liberalizing interest rates, allowing the possibility of bank deposit yields to go to market levels, not these very much repressed levels, could increase the share of personal income in the economy by 4 or 5%. These changes will take time, but they're essential if China is going to have a rebalancing away from reliance primarily on investment to relying more on consumption. Now, one more factor arguing for China to maintain a high growth rate going forward and confounding the pessimists like my good friend George Soros is that China, despite the huge growth of the last 20 and 30 years, is still a poor country by international standards. I had dinner 2 weeks ago in Chicago with Justin Lin. He's a very famous Chinese economist who was a year ago the research director of the World Bank, the first ever third world person to have that job. Justin said to me, if you look at Asian economic history and compare per capita income around the region to the United States, you can see we're at a very early stage in our development. Right now, their per capita GDP is 20% of America's. That's where Japan was in 1951, where Singapore was in 1967, where Taiwan was in 1975, and Korea in 1977. In the 20 years after each of these countries achieved this threshold, they had very high rates of economic growth. In Japan, the growth rate over the next 20 years was 9.2%. Singapore was 8.6%, Taiwan was 8.3%, Korea was 7.6%. My friend Justin Lin thinks that China, for this reason, can maintain a growth rate of at least 7 or 8% for at least 20 more years. Only dissension I would offer on this argument from my friend Justin Lin is that the labor force is quite different. During Japan's high growth period, the labor force increased by 44%. Singapore had increased by 89% because of immigration. Taiwan had increased by 48%, Korea by 56%. China now has no growth at all in the labor force. But China still has 300 million people living in the countryside, underemployed in areas like agriculture, who could move to the cities and give China the potential for much higher productivity growth as people move from one sector to the other. So anyway, if you believe Justin Lin's arguments, there's a case for China to have a high growth rate, not just 5 or 10 more years, but 20 more years. Now, China's economic takeoff is also now creating for the first time some geopolitical risks. It's been increasing its defense spending at a double-digit rate for over 10 years. It now spends $166 billion on defense compared to $22 billion in the year 2000. It's now second to the US, which spent $680 billion, but way ahead of the UK, which spends $61 billion, and Japan, which spends $60 billion. If we look at East Asia, it's also a big number. If we add up the countries of Southeast Asia, Korea, Taiwan, and Australia, their defense spending in 2012 was about $94 billion compared to $44 billion back in the year 2000. Deng Xiaoping said 30 years ago that China should pursue a policy of non-aggression in its foreign policy. It should avoid threatening its neighbors and basically focus on economic growth, not on having any kind of other territorial aspirations or any policy of belligerence. But there are signs now, of course, that China is becoming more belligerent. It's made claims to islands near Okinawa. The Japanese call these the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call these the Diaoyu Islands. And in the last 4 years, China's become far more aggressive in trying to exercise control of these islands. It's sending there lots of boats, more airplanes. And 2 years ago, a Chinese boat actually rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel. Then in November, China announced a new air identification zone which encompasses these islands. They also claimed an air identification zone over some reefs controlled by South Korea. Both Korea and Japan protested this move, as did the US, actually in Australia. You took Japan's side. But the Chinese policy has been successful. 35 airlines from 19 countries have now announced they'll respect this Chinese zone and give their flight plans to the Chinese Air Force. So China got what it wanted. But this was viewed by other countries in the region as quite aggressive. China's also had territorial disputes with the Philippines over some islands. They've sent naval vessels into the area. The Philippines is now trying to pursue a solution of this problem through international means. And China very much resents this. It doesn't want to have other powers play any role in determining its boundaries in the South China Sea. They've also had border conflicts as well not with Taiwan, but with Vietnam. So anyway, there's no doubt that China's becoming more belligerent and more aggressive. We simply don't know how far it will go. The Davos World Economic Forum in January, Prime Minister Abe actually made a comparison publicly among journalists between Japan and China in 2014 and the UK and Germany in 1914. Germany and Japan in 1914, Germany and Britain rather in 1914 had a high level of trade, a lot of financial flows. It was hard to imagine that Britain and Germany could ever have a war. Indeed, Norman Angell wrote a very important book in 1910 saying the European war is now impossible because of the high level of economic integration. Well, China and Japan have that kind of integration today. China is now Japan's most important trading partner. It takes over 20% of Japan's exports. In 2011 and 12, Japan had $25 billion of FDI in China. And Japanese firms in China now employ about 1.2 million people. So we have very much a high level of economic integration, but we also have at the same time a political conflict. And the challenge, obviously, going forward will be to manage these conflicts. And I think Prime Minister Abe made a big mistake back in late December by going to visit the Akasuni Shrine. The Chinese and the Koreans regard this shrine as one that honors the war criminals of the 1930s and 1940s, and they think the Japanese Prime Minister should avoid it. The last Prime Minister to go was Kazumi back in 2006. All the Prime Ministers that followed, and there were several, both in the LDP and the Democratic Party, avoided going to the shrine. So I think what Abe did was very, very provocative. And he did it because he's very much a passionate nationalist. He doesn't totally accept the Western view that World War II was totally wrong. And now, as a consequence of these disputes, he's announced in the last few weeks a big increase in Japanese defense spending. His budget for the next 4 years will be 230 trillion yen, 3% more than what they spent in the last 5 years. And they're going to be greatly increasing their purchases of amphibious vehicles, drones, fighter jets, and submarines to defend these islands. So it's a real concern, this new tension between Japan and China. I don't think anybody really wants a war, but with so much activity in the area, the danger, I think, is very high. There could be an accident, a collision of airplanes. This happened to a U.S. spy plane going over Hainan Island back in 2001. Now, what's the role of the United States in this whole process? America has very much tried to have in recent years strategic dialogue with China. We now have summits in both Washington and Beijing every year with high-level officials, the Treasury Secretary, other economic officials, sometimes also the Secretary of State, as well as the Chinese Foreign Minister. But accepting the rise of China is a very difficult thing for the Americans. We can see it in 2 recent votes involving Congress. Last week, we had a vote on changing IMF quotas. The U.S. agreed with other countries, the G20 countries, at the Seoul summit in 2010, we had to update the IMF by giving a much larger quota to China, Turkey, Korea, Mexico, successful developing countries. And the biggest change was China, going from 3.5% to just over 6%, number 3 to the U.S. and Japan. But last week, the Congress rejected this proposal. They voted it down because Republicans in Congress just don't like the IMF. Therefore, they don't want to update and reform it. This was a big embarrassment for the Obama administration, and it will be, I think, a very live issue at the coming G20 meeting in Brisbane, Australia this November. Second vote pending is on the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, the new free trade agreement between the U.S., Japan, several Asian countries, Australia, and Mexico. The president cannot go forward with this treaty unless he gets from the American Congress Trade Promotion Authority. This authorizes the president to negotiate a trade agreement that Congress cannot amend. It's a precondition for doing any deal. And basically, last week, Harry Reid, the Democratic Senate leader, announced he will not allow a vote on Trade Promotion Authority necessary to get TPP through Congress. This is the president's own party. And it reflects the fact his own party has become, over the last 20 years, very protectionist because of trade unions, who believe that free trade is a threat to American jobs. On every FTA we've had since 1993, starting with NAFTA, a majority of Democrats have voted no. And the president has this problem in his own party. His own leadership's not enough to compensate for this problem. I think what will be necessary to save TPP will be the Republicans winning control of the U.S. Senate in November. And the odds of that have gone up in recent months because the president's new health care program has been for him a huge disaster. He promised the American people for 3 years, if you like your health insurance policy, you can keep it. In the fourth quarter, 4 million Americans lost their insurance policies. This year, 15 million more could. The odds are very, very high Republicans could win control of the Senate in November if they can nominate competent candidates. And the big test will be the primaries in the next 12 weeks in all the American states. What we've got really is a two-way contest. The business lobbyists are spending lots of money to nominate intelligent, competent, center-right people. The so-called Tea Party faction is promoting people you classify here as crazy or nutty. And if the nutty people win, Republicans cannot win the Senate. But if the business lobbies prevail, Republicans, I think, have a very good chance of winning the Senate. And that may be what's necessary to save TPP. A further important issue in the balance of power in this region is American military spending. And that's now on a very sharp downward trajectory because of the gridlock we have on fiscal policy in general. We have a basic conflict between the two parties on core principles. Republican Party now refuses, under any circumstances, to raise taxes. No matter what the cause, they will not raise taxes. Democratic Party is very protective of the core entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Because we have an aging population, the health care bill is increasing all the time. And this will, over time, crowd out other sectors. And last year, to resolve fiscal disagreements, the two sides agreed on a compromise to cut discretionary spending over the next 10 years by $1 trillion. And half of discretionary spending is defense. As a result, our defense budget will fall from 4.8% of GDP last year to 2.6% by 2023. That is the lowest ratio since 1940, when it was 1.7%. Franklin Roosevelt tripled the number in 1941, anticipating a war with Europe, with Germany and Japan. And since then, we've never had defense spending go below 3% of GDP, even in the years after the Cold War. So we're going to new lows. And the danger with rising Medicare spending, and Republicans are willing to raise taxes, is that by 2030, American defense spending may be crowded down to only 2% of GDP. And in that scenario, America will not be the dominant global military power. It'll still have a large military, we'll still have new technologies, but it won't have the resources we've had in the modern period. Indeed, you can already see this in the Navy. At the current time, the American Navy has fewer ships than any time since 1914. And some of our most important bombers, like the B-52, are now 50 years old. And we were spending more money on new weapons here in the last 3 or 4 years, but because of sequestration and budget cuts, the Obama administration has now canceled a number of these new weapon systems. There's also been a very dangerous development in the Republican Party. That party has been, in the modern period, the real bastion of national security. Left-wing Democrats always want to cut defense spending, Republicans don't. The Republicans now have a new presidential candidate, Rand Paul, a Kentucky senator who wants to withdraw U.S. military forces all over the world. The same view his father had when he was running for president in previous years. Rand Paul is only 44 years old, and he has very strong support from the Tea Party faction. I don't believe he'll win the election in 3 years' time or 2 years' time, but the very fact a Republican is advocating these policies is, to me, a very dangerous sign. John McCain has called him a wacko. I think he is a wacko, but the reality is, in his own party, he's very attractive, he has a lot of support, and he could be a contender for the presidency in 2016. So I think all of this tells me the risk is very, very high that in 10 years' time, certainly in 15 years' time, America may not be able to guarantee Australia's security. And I think this will be for Australia a very, very major foreign policy challenge. What does this mean? It means Australia is now in a very delicate balancing act between the fact that China is your most important trading partner, taking a third of your exports, and the need to also maintain a close relationship with the United States and your traditional allies in the Western Alliance. China's had a relationship with China going back to the 1930s. Before 1941, you never had any embassies, but you did send trade commissioners to Australia, to China rather, and Japan in the early 1930s. And part of their mission, of course, was to gather political intelligence. Then in 1940, you established embassies in Washington, Tokyo, and the temporary Chinese capital at that time of Chongqing. And I think that shows that you're very committed. And since Gough Whitlam reestablished relations with China in 1972, every Australian prime minister has gone to China. Some have gone many times. You also had the very unique situation here 5 years ago. You had the only prime minister of the English-speaking world who was fluent in Mandarin. Many thought this would make Kevin Rudd very pro-Chinese. The reality is, of course, Kevin was very critical of the Chinese on issues like human rights, political freedom, how they treated dissidents. But the very fact you had a Chinese-speaking prime minister was still, I think, very, very unique. So what are Australia's alternatives? There aren't very many alternatives because there's no countries in this immediate region that can challenge China. They're all too small. I think the only country in this region with the potential to challenge China looking out 20 or 30 years is India. India right now is still a very backward country compared to China. It's only 30% urban. China is now over half urban, has very poor infrastructure, has very bad regulation of labor markets, which discourages the creation of large companies, has a lot of corruption. Its defense budget's only $45 billion, 1/4 of China's. But the fact is, India will have, going forward, 20 years, a larger population than China, a much younger population than China, and lots of potential, I think, for a high rate of economic growth. Whether they can achieve that depends very much on leadership. And right now, India has a leadership crisis. Prime Minister Singh had a good first term 5 years ago. His second term has been totally ineffective. They've also had major corruption scandals. This has really crippled business confidence and led to a big decline in capital spending. Indian growth has gone from 9% 3 years ago down to only about 4%. There's a very important election pending in India this May, and there will be a serious contender for the leadership coming from the BJP party led by Narendra Modi, the man who's been for 12 years Chief Minister of Gujarat State. As Chief Minister, he had very good economic policies, gave the state a growth rate a couple percentage points higher than India as a whole. He was very pro-foreign direct investment. He favored liberal policies to attract investment, and therefore he has very strong support right now from the Indian business community, Indian investors. The challenge, though, of course, is to win. And the big challenge will be to persuade Congress voters who are very unhappy to go to his party. And the alternative is the voters don't go to the BJP, they go to regional parties and create instead a very, very complex political outcome which may not be in favor of strong leadership. The danger has been magnified by the fact that back in November, a brand new party, an anti-corruption party, in English called the Common Man Party, won the New Delhi state election. It shocked everyone. They displaced the Congress premier who had been there for 15 years. This party has, of course, corruption is the major issue, but their other policies are a throwback to India 30 and 40 years ago. They're opposed to foreign direct investment, they're opposed to economic liberalization, they're very reactionary. But because of their victory in New Delhi, they've got massive national press coverage and may now run candidates for the national parliament in May. And the danger is they might win 35 or 40 seats. And if they do, the BJP party may not be able to achieve the 200 seats they would need to create a stable coalition government with other regional parties. So we have two extremes. BJP wins a clear victory because Congress is collapsing and can form an effective government to pursue necessary economic reforms, or we get a coalition of regional parties that will not be very coherent, not very effective, and could mean India is now sentenced to 3 or 4 years of 4 or 5% growth, far below its potential. And there's no way to predict the outcome. The opinion polls right now suggest that BJP should do well. They scored very well in the state elections back in November. But the reality is India is so heterogeneous, so complex, I don't think opinion polls can tell us that much. The country is just so different compared to Australia, America, or other more advanced countries. So I think the balance of power in this region is now very much in flux. The Obama administration wants a pivot towards Asia. It's invested political capital in that idea with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it has a problem with its own members in Congress, and therefore we may not be able to go forward. If we look out 5 or 10 years, we do have a profound fiscal challenge because of the rising cost of healthcare. And if we can't find some way to circumvent that, to control it, the danger is very great looking out 10 years. It could further crowd out the defense budget. Japan, I think, recognizes these dangers. They've now embraced a new alliance with India. They've now had joint naval maneuvers here in the last few months. And Abe has made speeches talking about Asia having a democratic security diamond, of which India would be a member. So I think the fact that Japan is embracing India should be a hint of how Australia should view the future. I think Australia should now also pursue a close relationship with India for both obvious economic reasons. They could be, as they urbanize, a huge new market for your raw materials the way China has been over the last 10 years. But also because in this new region, with America possibly withdrawing, you will need alternative powers to guarantee your own security. And I think looking out 20 or 30 years, the only country that can play that role is probably India. Why don't I stop there and take any questions you would have on these points or any others?
Thanks, David. Yes, I think we will, in the interest of finishing close to 2, just go straight to the questions. And we are recording this, so I might remove my Swiss-made watch just in case anyone gets the wrong impression. I suppose just Chairman's indulgence while people are thinking of a question for David. I mean, the title of your report, David, is called China's New Dream. And I suppose everyone in this room would know what the phrase the American dream is, means. What is China's new dream? How would you nutshell it for us? What is it?
Well, I think from the comments of Xi Jinping, it's quite simple. He wants China to have a large increase in living standards and real incomes to catch up with the advanced countries, not just be a low-income developing country. And also he wants respect for China in the global community. He wants China to now be a global power, recognized as such, to have a larger vote at the IMF, to be an effective player in the G20, to gain the recognition that goes with any country that could in 10 years' time be the world's largest economy. And as I've just mentioned, these are challenges. The American Congress won't give China the IMF quota it deserves. The American Congress won't approve the TPP, which China, by the way, doesn't belong to. And therefore, it is, for countries like the United States, a very difficult challenge. The Americans have not come to terms with the fact that China has become a great economic power and may in 10 years' time have a larger economy.
Thank you. Professor Baldy, can we get a microphone?
David, you and I go back a long way.
Yes.
You and I go back a long way, and
yeah.
As you know, I have some differences of emphasis. If I could be extremely vulgar, we might be talking here about China's wet dream.
Yeah.
Can I put 3 things to you, and I know you'll
Yeah.
respond eloquently as always. Firstly, in terms of Marxist-Leninist correlation of world forces, as the Chinese leadership would have it, when you're sat in Beijing, it doesn't look very good. Who are their real friends in the Asia-Pacific? A lunatic country called North Korea.
Right.
Until recently, Myanmar, which has suddenly defected to democracy, and a rogue state called Pakistan. And the more China's becoming aggressive in the East and South China Seas, and still from time to time on the Himalayan border, the less the correlation of world forces is in their favour. That's point number 1. Point number 2, can I suggest to you that you didn't quite address what are the geopolitical implications of a rapidly ageing workforce with the cost of labour increasing and with the impost of pension, aged care, healthcare has an opportunity cost foregone in terms of what you can spend on defence. The third point, and you and I have discussed this before, I don't buy this one of the coming Chinese military superpower. It is not a superpower now. It does not have global nuclear reach, unlike the former Soviet Union and the United States. It certainly doesn't have the global conventional reach that America has and the former Soviet Union had. And where are these innovations in Chinese military capabilities? There'll be people here who will tell me that at the classified level, of course, the Chinese are making undoubted progress, and I accept that. But you look at their order of battle, now and foreseeably, a lot of it is reverse-engineered Russian stuff. Sukhoi fighters, Kilo-class submarines, and so on. And let's not overreact to some toy aircraft carrier or some stealth fighter that has never had operational demonstration. My final point is, unlike the United States of America, the Chinese have never experienced modern, conventional warfare. They have zip knowledge or experience, with all that means for joint command and control and warfighting. I mean, the last time they had a conflict was to teach Vietnam a lesson in '78, and I was in the intelligence game when that happened, and they lost.
I know.
So put all those together, and please give me a reply.
Well, the answer is, everything you said is true. And when I suggest China will be a major power looking at 10 or 15 years, it's after their GDP is not $10 trillion, but more like $20 trillion. And because they're willing to spend all this money on R&D and can allocate resources based on their priorities without having to go through a democratic process where you have fights over things like pensions, healthcare, and military spending, the odds are they could have, by the year 2025, a defense budget as large or larger than the United States. They can, I think, over 15 years, master new technologies, develop their own technologies, perhaps in some cases, and be a more formidable force. So everything I'm saying on the 15-year outlook is obviously speculative. But if you look at current trends, they clearly suggest that by the year 2025 or 30, China could be a very, very major power, not just in the region, but globally. And the danger is very, very high for the reasons I outlined. America may not be as formidable a military power as it's been over the last 75 or 80 years. And the problem is our political system is at the current time very, very dysfunctional. One thing that could change my pessimism on the US would be if we had another shock like 9/11. I think if there is a major threat, the American people will respond. If they see a clear threat, the Republican Party will give up on no tax increases and accept the need we need to spend more on defense. But if the American people don't see a clear threat, the danger is this gridlock continues. We resolve just budget disagreements by simply squeezing defense spending a bit more every year. So your points are very accurate. I agree with everything you said, but I view the situation as very transitory and very much evolving. And on current trend lines, China will have, I think, by the year 2025, a defense budget as large as America's, if not larger.
Okay, can I request the next couple of people, we just get straight to the question, no backtracking. Neil James and then Doug Kenny, and then Hikins and then down here.
Neil James from the Australian Defence Association. My question very much builds on what Paul just said. The Soviet Union was up a volta with rockets, and China was the exact opposite in both regards. There's a dimension missing, though, from the analysis, surely, and that is, as no two democracies have fought a war between each other or been a major threat to the world since 1812, we're really in a race against time until China democratises. And I personally reject the proposition that Chinese culture is inimical to democracy, because you've only got to see the example of Taiwan.
Right.
If China did democratise, whether it took 5 years, 25, 80, 100, do we not then face an entirely different strategic situation, because a rising China would not be aggressive, it would be cooperative in the international system?
Well, there's no doubt that if China could become democratic over 25 years, it would lessen the threat of China becoming belligerent, aggressive, and doing things that we think are detrimental to our security. I think China will become democratic over time, but it's not going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. Just in the last few months, Xi Jinping has put many political dissidents in jail. He had a guy who was arrested a few weeks ago and put in jail who led a campaign against corruption. They had bloggers a year ago showing pictures of middle-level bureaucrats wearing $100,000 wristwatches, exposing corruption, but they've gone to jail. So it's very clear the Communist Party doesn't want competition in this game. They want to make sure they control it, to go after the people they want to get. They don't want anybody else, offering suggestions. But one of the anomalies of China is how successful it's been without becoming democratic. We did have democracy come to Korea and Taiwan back in the 1970s and 80s as their economies took off. They had rising living standards and therefore just had different aspirations. I'm sure that will happen in China over time, but it's not going to happen quickly. I think China will still be authoritarian for at least 15 or 20 more years. There'll be a new generation by then. There'll be thousands of people, not thousands, hundreds of thousands who went to school in Australia, the US, other parts of the world, and maybe because of their experience, they'll accelerate the transition to democracy. But that still is, at the current time, very speculative, and all we can do is just watch and wait to see how it plays out. But I think, again, your points are very, very accurate. But you've got to imagine the world in 2030 when China's GDP is maybe $5 or $6 trillion larger than America's.
Dr. King.
Doug King from Office of National Assessments. This is, I think, a simple question. What are the differences between economic interdependence between Germany and Britain before 1914 and economic interdependence between Japan and China nowadays? In particular, is there a difference in the mix of trade, investment, and interdependency in jobs?
Well, the big difference is the global supply chains. Back when Britain and Germany were competing 100 years ago, they tended to sell goods that were produced 100% at home. They made all the components at home, they assembled the goods at home, shipped them to other parts of the world. Today we have incredibly complex supply chains. China runs a big trade deficit with Japan and Korea and Taiwan because they import the components they use to produce finished goods they sell to the Americans and the Europeans and the Australians. You've got highly integrated supply chains. So any kind of military conflict would undermine this system completely. It would mean that trade would collapse. There's no way that China could be a major exporting nation if it didn't have access to these components. Now, over time, they may become more self-sufficient in these components, but at the current time, almost 60% of the value added of Chinese exports goes to multinational companies, to firms that are part of global supply chains. So the level of interdependence now is much, much greater. Not to mention the new developments in telecommunications technology. I mean, we have massive capital transfers now over electronic wire lines. We didn't have that in 1914. Money moved, but it moved very, very slowly. So the level of integration is truly unprecedented. And the integration's increasing every day and every week because of the impact of technology and the ability to move information, move money, move goods. So I think any kind of war now would be more catastrophic than it was in 1914. And therefore, I don't believe anybody wants to go to war. The danger, I think, is an accident. And somebody becoming overly provocative and doing something that then, increases the danger of, a mistake. The fact about China is that they have become very belligerent here in the last 3 or 4 years. They now feel because of their economic takeoff, they can take more risks. And the danger is they make a misjudgment and go too far. But if they do, they will suffer as much as anybody they might want to challenge, because they're very much integrated now into the global economy, very integrated. And this is, again, totally different from the Soviet Union 30 and 40 years ago. Russia had trade, but in a few commodities like oil, some of the base metals like nickel or palladium, which they have a lot of. But they never had any real role in the global economy. They were totally isolated because of the economic system they had. China still has elements of a communist economy, the big SOEs and so on, but the dynamism in China's economy in the last 20 years has come from the private sector, which has had tremendous growth.
More specific question. You mentioned the TPP a couple of times. How important is the TPP, at least for the United States itself, if political conditions did permit it to get approved? What would be the geoeconomic significance were a deal to be able to be concluded, at least with the present partners in the TPP? Imagining a more positive scenario going forward, at least for that enterprise.
Well, it's viewed as a way to promote opening in countries like Vietnam. Vietnam has opened up a lot in the last 20 years, but still is much more of a communist country than other countries in the region. The major breakthrough, I think, is Japan. I had a meeting a few months ago with the TPP negotiator for Japan. He speaks English very fluently. He's a very good diplomat. And he said to me, Abe has 3 elements of his economic program. One is fiscal stimulus, which they had last year. Second is monetary stimulus, which is the most ambitious and most aggressive of any industrial country in the last 80 years. Doubling the money supply in 2 years, that kind of thing. And third is structural reform, to make Japan more competitive. And he said to me, the key factor driving structural reform in Japan today is TPP, to make us more competitive. Japan's done free trade agreements with small countries, with Singapore, with ASEAN, but they have no trade agreement with a major industrial region like the United States or Europe. They have not done that. Korea's done that, but Japan has not done it. This on the margin has made Japan somewhat less competitive. So the Abe government itself views TPP as the way to achieve a lot of domestic microeconomic reform. So I think for Japan, this is critically important. For America, it's a positive, but not a huge positive, because America's economy is already quite competitive, and we don't need trade agreements to be successful in the areas where we're successful. But I think for Japan, it's critically important. Then you've got countries like Canada. Canada still depends very heavily on trade with the United States and Europe. Emerging markets don't factor very large yet in Canadian trade. China is selling more to China, but still very, very modest compared to Australia. So my guess would be that with this kind of agreement, Canada could benefit from having a much better market opening, not just to Japan, but to the whole of East Asia, but not China, because China is not part of the TPP. China has talked about joining the TPP. I've had Chinese economists tell me the Shanghai Free Trade Zone they announced back in August was the first step to TPP. But the USTR has told me China can't join for at least 10 years. But again, going out 10 years, that could be a further positive for China's economy, and again, promoting more global economic integration.
I'll take one last question, then I'll draw it to a close. No? Yes, Dr. Fee.
I was tempted, I get the last question. I've genuinely been captivated by your talk, fascinating analysis of the region. I have a very simple question, and it's very much targeted at the Australian audience that you have here, very senior policymakers, and it's a very simple question. So what? So what for Australia? What does Australia do about all of these various situations that you've outlined? Please, if you can offer some advice.
Can I narrow, that's a cue, but that was the question on my mind. I mean, should we be worried in Australia about China's investment, its increasing financial connections to Australia? I mean, is that something that we should worry about in any way? That's what you're getting at?
Yeah. I think China's exposure to Australia is a natural outcome of the fact that China became 5 years the world's biggest importer of base metals, iron ore, other commodities. And you've got most of those commodities in great abundance. So it's natural China would have trade with you and also want to invest here. And the fact is the Chinese are possessive. I spoke at a commodity conference in Beijing a year and a half ago, and I had as a co-panelist the head of China's Iron and Steel Association. He said, our goal for the year 2015 is to import half of our iron ore from Chinese-owned mines elsewhere in the world, meaning Australia, meaning South Africa, meaning Brazil, and also now very much in West Africa, where there's been huge iron ore discoveries that need billions of dollars of infrastructure to develop and bring product to market. So I think that relationship you have with China is a very natural one, and I would not rule out your foreign trade with China going to 35 or 40%. Back in 1927, you sent 38% of your exports to the United Kingdom, the so-called mother country. I could see that same ratio of trade with China over the next 4 or 5 years. Is that a threat? No. It means you've got a great market. But it will have political consequences. When China is your most important market, you've got to be more sensitive to how the Chinese feel about other issues. There's no danger China will invade you, then get everything they want just through commerce and trade. But if in the year 2030 America's gone, and China is the dominant power, that I think will have an impact on your ability to have a totally autonomous foreign policy. In November, you criticized China for the air identification zone that they put over Japan and Korea. In 2030, you might not be as critical. So that, I think, will be the trade-off. It'll be managing diplomacy in quite different circumstances than you've had over the last 75 or 80 years when America was clearly the dominant power. But I think you can resolve all your problems with diplomacy. And again, this is a global issue. I was in Africa giving a speech last week at the Davao Mining Congress. I saw African finance mining ministers and lots of Africans, and China's a huge investor, and now it scares them a little bit. China may become too big and too dominant. One very well-placed academic in South Africa told me he now thinks there are 3 million Chinese living in Africa. They're not there because of the government, they went on their own. They've got trading businesses, they explore for gold in Ghana, and it's artisanal mining. It's very primitive, but it makes money. It's a huge presence. As Paul mentioned, Myanmar's had a big U-turn in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, Myanmar could not get any Western investment because of sanctions. They relied totally on China, which built pipelines, big hydro stations, was investing in the mining sector. When they opened up 3 years ago, that transformed everything. Foreign firms are now flocking to Burma. I was there giving a speech last year, and the hotel was packed with businessmen looking to do deals. And guess what? 2 years ago, the Burmese government canceled a big Chinese hydro project because of local protests. Under military rule, that would never have happened. But now that Myanmar is becoming democratic, the Chinese were held in check. And they're very upset. They don't like having competition. But the reality is Myanmar knew 5 years ago if they didn't open up to the West, they'd become simply a Chinese satellite. That, I think, was an important factor driving the process of market opening and political liberalization. So anyway, China's perceived everywhere as a possible threat. Even after a deal was done in Canada a year ago, they bought, back in November of 2012, a Canadian oil company called Nexen. It was a big deal. Market cap was $15 billion. It's not just Canadian oil they had American oil, they had North Sea oil. But after the deal was done, Prime Minister Harper said, this is the last time we'll let state-owned enterprise buy a major American company, a major Canadian company. And he said that because Canada itself has tried to privatize its natural resource industry. They had for a time a state-owned company, but they've sold it off a few years ago. And he felt that, well, he wanted a lot of foreign investment, didn't want it to be state-controlled. He wanted something that came from the private sector. At the current time, given the structure of China's oil industry, the private sector simply isn't large enough to do a deal of that size. That could only have been done by an SOE. So your concerns here about China are global concerns. They're not unique to Australia. And all you can do is look around the world and see how countries develop various policies to cope with this challenge.
Well, David, fascinating discussion of China's national wealth and how it relates to its behaviour and national power. And I, for one, was very grateful that it was jargon-free. I've been to a few talks by economists, and I must be honest, I haven't understood a word of it. But I think I understood every word you said, which I think is very good. As I say, David's report is now available on the ASPI website, or you can purchase it as well, for those who like the crackle of paper, like me. And the last thing I would say to Professor Dibb's suggestion, if we do issue a second edition, Professor, we will study your suggestion for its new title very closely. But at this stage, it's the report's China's New Dream, How Australia and the World Will Cope with the Re-emergence of China as a Great Power. Could I ask you to join with me and thank David Hale very much?